Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. It's great to see such a big crowd here, and this is going to be a really good evening, so looking forward to it. So, welcome to the Gibsons Public Market, located on the traditional unceded territory of the Squamish First Nation. And tonight is the first of 9 presentations that the Blue Act Marine Society has organized for 2025. And so we're building that speaker series on the follow-up to the climate fair that was here last September. Maybe many of you were here. We had about 300 people or so. And when we had that fair, a lot of people said, yeah, this was great. I'd really like more practical ideas about how I can take actions either individually or collectively. So the committee that worked on that, the Climate Fair Committee, or CFC, not a great acronym for a climate group, but we thought about this. And so so during this speaker series, we'll have Mark's talk tonight about how to reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. We'll have a couple of sessions in March on improving the energy efficiency of your home, including solar panels and heat pumps and other things. Reducing property and health risks from fires. That'll be in April. Teaching kids about climate change. We'll have 3 teachers. Johan has helped to get that organized, who talk to kids about climate change and how to do it in a way that leaves them hopeful rather than hopeless. And then Town of Gibsons, we're talking about reducing flood risks. And there'll be some talks later in the fall about reducing the climate footprint of what you eat and how you travel. So big thanks to the Town of Gibsons and the Sunshine Coast Credit Union, who are financially supporting the speaker series, and to the small team that we've worked with Blue Act to make it all happen, and to the creators of the yummy treats at the back of the room, Liz Wood and my wife Betty Bronson. So you can sneak back there anytime or at the end of the talk. All of these talks are free, and we welcome donations to sustain the important marine education and conservation work by Blue Act, including the aquarium downstairs that I'm sure you know. And you may wonder, what's the link between marine ecosystems and climate change? Well, reducing the severity of climate change helps all ecosystems, terrestrial, freshwater, marine, and the human and non-human life forms that depend on those ecosystems. So, I'm delighted to introduce Mark Jacquard, a distinguished professor at Simon Fraser University in the School of Resource and Environmental Management. He's the current chair and CEO of the BC Utilities Commission, and that regulates BC's energy utilities, the reliability of the electrical grid, and other matters. Mark's worked in BC, in Canada, internationally, applying models of energy, economy, and emissions to assess the effectiveness of different climate policies, including serving on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is a shortened bio, the one's even longer than this. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. In 2009, was named British Columbia Academic of the Year. And 3 of his books have been shortlisted for the Donner Prize for the top policy book in Canada, with one of them winning that prize. And his latest book is The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success, Overcoming Myths That Hinder Progress. And Mark kindly brought with him on the ferry today 8 of his books, which are on sale for $20, and all the proceeds go to Blue Act. So he's essentially donating the books.
Now, David.
There's what?
There's only 4 left.
There's only 4 left.
Don't start a rush.
So it's from 8 to 4 to 2 to 1 to half a book, so it's exponentially declining. So thanks so much, Mark. You're a super busy guy. Really appreciate you coming over here to Gibsons to enlighten us on different paths to reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. Mark will speak for maybe 45 minutes or an hour, and then we'll have an hour for questions and answers. And if Mark's vocal cords are still working, and some folks are keen, we can continue the conversations at Gibson's Tapworks subsequently. That's the plan. And he approved the plan. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks for inviting me, and thank you for coming. I appreciate the opportunity to do this. I want to say that when someone introduces me and says he'll speak for an hour, I don't know, if I'm in the audience, I'm like, an hour? And so actually I don't intend to speak for an hour. It'll be more like 35 minutes. That's what I'm going to aim for. And then please, let's have a conversation after that. So probably don't cut me off when I'm going through the slides. I mean, unless you really didn't understand something on a slide, but I can also go back to the slides. So let me try to get through it. And then I'd really like to have a conversation. And I've already been talking to some of you, and you know that I love to do that. And there's lots to engage on, of course. I might just say that one reason I did say yes to this, because I do get quite a few requests and I really don't have much time, was because of Dave Marmurick, who I have known for a very long time. I'm in an interdisciplinary school that works in sustainability, environment, and resources. And part of all about that, which you'll hear a bit about here, is about how to make decisions, how to think about problems. And Dave has been an inspiration to people in our school and to a whole wider stream of colleagues and researchers. And I just wanted to mention that you're very lucky to have someone like this. And he doesn't get acknowledged sometimes as much as you should, but he might get acknowledged a bit more. So you never know.
Mark, before you continue, I just want to make sure, can people hear Mark, or do you want him to use the mic? Everybody good?
So I've got a mic here.
Yes.
And I'm not going to hold it here. I'm really loud.
Okay.
But if you have trouble, just start waving your hands, okay? Please. But thanks for checking. Always good. Yeah. All right. I'm going to get started. Not quite sure. Okay. So the goal of the 2020 book and of this talk, and I fear that I'll be giving this talk still for quite a long time, and that book will not lose its relevance, is to help climate-concerned citizens detect deliberate delusions and inadvertent myths, different things there, and elect climate-sincere politicians who do effective policy. And also then cut your personal emissions, but that part's really simple. As Dave said, you'll have other people to help you with that. But a big message in any talks I give and in my book is be careful of anyone's tendency, other people, our own, to make the problem more complicated than it actually is. And that's why I do say things like 2 fuel switching actions. If your home heating and your vehicle are not emitting greenhouse gases, you've done a lot. Focus there. You know, it isn't the kind of straw you use. I mean, those are all important things, but it's actually quite simple. And a key theme here is about human thinking, human cognition, and the kind of biases we have. And I'll start it off with a couple of quotes that I like. The first one is from Sinclair Lewis, who was an American writer and political thinker about 100 years ago. And or Upton Sinclair, sorry, wrong name. Sinclair Lewis wrote Main Street. Anyway, I'm getting old, I'm confusing names. Sinclair was right. It's difficult to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it. And we can smile and think about that, and that's, of course, a bias which relates to self-interest. Self-interest bias. But I'm going to have a second quote here from Bertrand Russell, British philosopher, also about 100 years ago, who wrote differently about this and said, what someone believes on grossly insufficient evidence is an index into their desires. Now, why am I using both of those, right? The one of them we smile at and say, oh, I know, you make your money in the fossil fuel industry. We know how you're going to see climate science. But the other one that I'm going to be getting at in this topic, in this talk, is about ourselves. Where are the things that we want to believe, and because they fit into the rest of some kind of vision that we have, and therefore maybe we're a bit biased about the evidence too. And is there a way that I, in writing a book like this, or giving a talk like this, or things that I engage in with people might help in that process? And part of that, the example I'll give you is what I do as part of a someone who has led a graduate seminar in sustainable energy for about 37 years. So I'm going to show you a bit about that. It's about getting people to think critically and really challenge their own ideas. Now, I'll show you a photo here. I teach this grad course. It's interdisciplinary. We do thermodynamics, we do engineering and technologies, we do economics, we do policy, we do sociology and psychology and diplomacy. And the students are graduate students in this interdisciplinary program, and here they are in my dining room. And so for all those years, we would hold the class. The students loved that. It was a lot of work actually to arrange tables once a week for that semester. But what I want to get at is that what I would do, let's say this is the first class in September at my house, and I would get them to tell me about something they think, what they feel strongly about, something to do with energy and sustainability. It's really easy because it's like nuclear power or fracking, or for a long time it was the Site C Dam. Like, do you think we should build the Site C Dam or not? And they would always say, no, you should not build the Site C Dam. And I would say, give me the best arguments for not building the Site C Dam. And they were great. Like they're all, as undergrads, they're all straight A students to get into our program. Very smart. Then I would say to them, good. Now, I know when you went to junior high school and high school, you did debates where you would be on one side and you're supposed to get the best arguments on this side of some particular issue, and other people were supposed to get the best arguments on the other side. And what that basically did is it trained you to be really good thinking like a lawyer, which is give me the best arguments in a position that you have to defend. I say to them, no. I want you to be the very best at debating yourself. And so now with Site C, you just said Site C and you told me why we shouldn't do it. Now for the rest of the class, give us the best reasons to build the Site C Dam. And they're terrible at it. Like, they're just terrible. And I'd say, okay, come on, you guys are straight A students, you're really smart, let's try it again. And then they get a little better, and a little better. And eventually they really took to it, and they really realized that they had not exercised their brains, or when they read things, to find the elements that are really counter to what their position was. And so in this book, in this talk, and in anything I do publicly, I'm trying to encourage the people who do care and want climate action to perhaps be more effective, and being more effective by actually being hard on yourselves. And so I'm going to bring up some issues as we get through here, and we'll have a chance. We'll have a chance for me to argue why, who knows, that it's okay that there's subsidies for fossil fuels, or who knows what we'll look at and see, how can we be thinking about that as critically as possible, and that might make us more effective. At least that's the thesis that I'm trying to get across today. You'll decide if I've done a good job. Going through that critical thinking, it should enable us. So one of the things I do, if for example, I'm against the Site C Dam, I want to read the very smartest arguments in favor of it. I don't want to just dismiss some easy stuff that's easy to dislike or hate. So I really want to see what leading thinkers are thinking, and what kind of exercises they went through to get to those positions. And I'm going to show you a bit of that by talking about what is the essential task that needs to happen for greenhouse gas reduction, i.e. to forestall, reduce, diminish climate change. The essential task is stop the open burning of fossil fuels. Now already that's a trick question, because why did I put the word open in there? So I didn't say stop the burning of fossil fuels. I said stop the open burning of fossil fuels. There's a hint for you already. Why would you say that? So what are the challenges to that? Well, you're going to see I'm going to have like 4 key challenges, and then 2 solutions, and then 4 things that are stopping us. And that's the talk. The 4 key myths about this, and I'm taking this I'm arguing this comes from leading researchers. And through my experience in the IPCC and so on, but of course the book makes the case. You don't have to take my word for it. The first myth is that fossil fuels are expensive. So what am I getting at? Well, people will say, oh good, renewables are now cheaper than fossil fuels, or that all of these things are cheaper. Energy efficiency is cheaper than using fossil fuels. I hear that a lot. You may have heard it a lot. You may have accepted it as what I call a working hypothesis, that, yeah, I think I'll assume that's correct. So it's the assumption that, oh good, we'll start to switch away from fossil fuels because it's cheaper to have an electric car, it's cheaper to get a heat pump, it's cheaper to have a more energy efficient building. In reality, the evidence, most leading scholars that are independent of any particular interest or bias that I've seen would say fossil fuels are plentiful, they're high quality, it's the most high quality form of energy you can imagine, and they're low cost. They get cheaper with innovation and declining demand. So I'll run into people who say, well, we're really into innovation. And I'm saying, oh yeah, those innovations that led to fracking, you mean, or to how we can quickly make LNG. Yeah, we innovate all the time. And fossil fuels really benefit from that innovation because they have the head start. They're incumbent, so our system's built on them, but they're also very high quality. They're the reason humans have glommed onto fossil fuels is not just because some evil person talked us into it. They're fantastic. And so they offer still the lowest cost developing path for 5 billion people. Maybe it's 6 billion now. The book is in 2020. And I have a graph here, just shows, think about China from 1980, and I was on this thing called the China Council, going there twice a year for years, helping them with climate policy, or with energy policy and greenhouse gas policy. And some things that have come to fruition now, though, renewables production and electric vehicles. But they burned fossil fuels for that tremendous economic takeoff they had from 1980 to about 2005, let's say 2010. And in concert with that was an amazing use of coal and other fossil fuels. And so look at China. This is CO2 emissions, and it's really fossil fuel related. And you can see how China pulls away from India and then passes the EU and the US. And this is even just data up to around 2016, I think, or something like that. So that's number one. Fossil fuels are expensive. I'm saying no. Fossil fuels are actually cheap. So it's going to give us some challenges here. Second one is we'll voluntarily reach an effective global agreement. So every year there are meetings somewhere on the planet throughout almost my entire career. And I went to the first couple of them, and I have not gone anymore. I don't try to say anything negative. I feel great about the people who try to do that, but they also are under pressure to come away with an agreement. And if you look at these agreements, they're not really agreements to do anything. And so we go through this act that we're actually acting when we're not. We actually need a binding international treaty, but we lack global government, and rich and poor countries disagree on the fair sharing of costs by a mile, and yet we keep going to these negotiations, which are entirely voluntary. And that's why, since at least the Kyoto Agreement, I've agreed with David Victor, who won the Nobel Prize? Nordhaus, who right from that time, so that's 1998, 99, said, oh no, you need countries to put carbon tariffs on, and a few countries if it has to be, but that's the only way we get there. And so the book has a chapter on that. So 3 decades of failures at the annual COP negotiations. So as I said at the bottom here, we need leading countries to form what are called climate clubs. That's happening now. Europeans are doing that. So there's some interesting possibilities. What's the third of the key myths? That climate policy debates are sincere. Now I probably don't have to do much convincing of this group. But this is a real challenge, and I'll talk about it later, that The task for climate-sincere politicians is really difficult because the public's concern for the climate threat depends on the urgency of other immediate concerns. And
Tariffs.
you know, we could say tariffs and Trump, but there was also Trump, 5 years ago. There's COVID, there's war, there's all of these things, and the public's interest and ours kind of go up and down with that. Also, the insincere politicians can fake it. They simply say, oh yeah, I've got this distant greenhouse gas target, but they don't actually implement anything that would help us that would cause us, motivate us, incentivize us, and to some extent force us to transition. And the insincere politicians can exaggerate the economic harm from effective policies, right? So all the modeling that we do when Pierre Poilievre says, emissions, or that there's going to be a horrible economic harm from the climate policies we have, whether it's a carbon tax or other policies, there's no basis for that, and so that's a big challenge. And that's why you have things like this is from Ontario when Doug Ford first came into power in 2018 or whatever year that was, and that was the French Gilets jaunes protest, which was a tiny percentage increase in their carbon tax. So number 3 was climate policy debates are sincere, and that's a myth. So you've got to be ready for that. And the last one is that greenhouse gas reduction is complicated. And so here's a typical quote, and I had no trouble finding this quote. And the person the writer who said this is good researcher and so on, but she bought into the simple message that fossil fuels are so integrated into our lives that phasing them out would require us to change everything about how and where we live, how we get around, and how we make money. And that's entirely not true. If any of you drove here in an electric car, you know that things didn't change very much. So this is the commonly held complexity assumption. You still got seats up here. Come on up. Complexity assumption is a key reason for climate failure, as everyone then can add their pet solution instead. But in fact, as I'm arguing, the path is simple if we focus strategically. And in fact, there's only 2 components to that simple path. So I'll get to those now. 1, focus on key actions in key sectors. So I'm going to talk about actions. That's when you actually do something that makes emissions lower than they otherwise would be. That's an action. Then policy. Those are things that drive actions. So those are the things I'm going to talk about. Actions and policies in this part of the talk. What are the key actions? Rapidly phase out the open burning of coal, oil, and most uses of natural gas. The key sectors are electricity and transportation. And why? We have the technologies there and the costs are modest, and actions in these domestic sectors are easier because with the major industrial products that we make, that we manufacture, steel, aluminum, products like that are trade exposed. So if someone says to you, oh, we're going to get industry to pay for this, nobody who's acting on climate is getting industry to pay. The Scandinavians are moving quickly on reducing emissions. They're not getting their industries to pay because their industries have to compete in global trade where other people don't have climate policies. So if someone's telling you that, that's already a sign that you should be suspicious. And it turns out, though, that if we think of the growth in the world in the developing countries, it's transportation and electricity, because electricity is also air conditioning, right? So space conditioning is a big one. And the growth in those 2 sectors, you get those to zero emission or near zero, and you're already making enormous progress. And I've got so I'm just going to show you this diagram we put together. Yes?
Is it okay to ask a question now or at the
I
end?
was going to wait till after. Yeah. So and I'll hop back in the slides if you want as well. So if you look at this diagram, this is a forecast of emissions in the year 2050, done by a standard model in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So what does it show you? First of all, the size of the pies represent the amount of CO2 emissions, energy-related CO2 emissions. And the OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, more associated with the wealthier countries, but non-OECD also has China in it as well. But as you can see, the forecast is that transportation and electricity are more than half of all the emissions. So imagine, we know what to do in electricity. We're doing it. British Columbia's done it. Lots of jurisdictions have done it. We know what to do in transportation. That's happening quicker now. Norway, China, we are trying. And so we have all of that. So that is a sign for optimism, by the way. And none of this stuff Trump or anyone can actually stop, right? It's happening in jurisdictions. It's happening at the state level in the United States. California is driving this, most of Europe, and then now developing world, and with China exporting electric vehicles and soon electric trucks. So there's a lot of good news there. That's where we focus in terms of actions. Now, what about the policies to get us there? So there are policies where governments say, we're going to inform you and we hope you do a better job of this or that or the other thing. That's fine for governments to do that, but often that in the past, that's been a way for governments to avoid the policies they have to do to actually reduce emissions because fossil fuels are so cheap. So because they're so cheap and fantastic, we have to fight our way away from fossil fuels. And that's the biggest part of the problem. We have to fight our way from the open burning of fossil fuels, not necessarily from fossil fuels. So here is a schema of all the policy options that are out there. So already it looks complicated, but it actually is very simple, and this is my effort again to simplify. Governments will give you a list of 80 policies they're gonna do. They all fall into these categories. In fact, most of them are in the non-compulsory category. They are various kinds of information or labels or some kind of subsidy, or government saying we're gonna do something with our own fleet. But what we really need are what I and others will call the compulsory policies. And those split into pretty neat categories. Let's go to the carbon pricing one, because everybody here would have heard about carbon tax. So that's sort of the one that gets all the attention, carbon tax. But does Quebec have a carbon tax? No. Does California have a carbon tax? No. Do they have carbon pricing? Yes. So what they have is something called cap and trade. Both jurisdictions have put a cap on emissions. And then people are allowed to get permits that add up to the cap. And people are allowed to trade those, and the permits decline over time. And that trading price is a carbon price. It affects the price of gasoline just like a carbon tax. The price of natural gas just like and the price of coal. It has the same effect. Europe, all of Europe, is in a cap and trade system. So that's the dominant system in the world, not carbon tax. We also have regulations, and I point out two kinds of regulations because yes, we can have what are called prescriptive regulations, which are really saying, you have to buy this kind of technology, as opposed to flexible regulations, which say you have to achieve a certain performance, but we're not going to tell you which technologies, and we're not going to tell you how to achieve it. Just achieve that performance target. And I'm going to give you an example of that, because those are actually what are dominating what we're doing right now is flexible regulations. And surprise, surprise, over the years, that's become my expertise, because I've noticed that that's where sincere governments will want to go, unless maybe someone talked them into a carbon tax, but I can tell you it wasn't me if that happened. So what are flexible regulations? Here's my examples. It's where you say you have to have a minimum market share for some low greenhouse gas technology, or a maximum and rising market share for like renewables or something like that. And yet it has what economists like. It has some of the economic efficiency, because we're trying to reduce our emissions at the lowest possible cost, and it is going to cost us because moving away from open burning of fossil fuels is going to be more expensive. They're technology neutral, as I said. They allow trading among sellers for compliance, and I'm going to give you examples. One is here in BC, we have a clean electricity regulation. And over the last few years, I've been helping the Trudeau federal government develop one, which they implemented officially just in the last year. And what does that do? It says that if you're an electricity generator, you have to stay below a maximum amount of CO2 per kilowatt hour that's going to fall over time. But there might be other generators who are already at zero, but they only needed to be at 8. Everybody has to be at, let's say, 80%, or some level. And some people have already done even better than that. They get surplus credits that they trade to other generators. So if you were a company that was 100% renewable electricity, you generate credits, and that helps to subsidize the people who are still burning too much coal or too much natural gas or even oil to make electricity. They have to buy the credits from you, and that makes it more expensive for them, and that helps to subsidize your development of wind and solar. So in the United States, how many states do you think have this policy? It's 35 states, and they've had it for 10. Texas was the leader. That's why Texas has wiped out coal plants and oil burning for electricity, and they started that when George Bush was the governor of Texas a long time ago. And Trump did not said we're going to start burning coal again to make electricity. He had zero effect. You can't affect something like that. Another example, and in BC, I was blessed enough to actually design the policy that was implemented in BC in January 2007, which we've had since then. It meant that BC Hydro had signed contracts for 2 coal plants, one to be built at Princeton and one up in Taylor to generate electricity, and they had to cancel those. And it was going to build the Duke Point natural gas plant, electric fired, and had to let that one go. And so we've had it in BC's almost 20 years, which is why we're effectively at zero emission. The other one is the zero emission vehicle mandate, which California implemented a long time ago, but we've implemented more recently in British Columbia as part of the clean energy plan that John Horgan's government put in, and that the current government is still trying to sustain. And that says vehicle sellers have to achieve a minimum percentage of ZEVs or buy surplus credits from firms who overperform. And this is interesting. So it meant that, you probably don't want to hear this, but Tesla made a lot of money from this. Yeah, you knew where I was going. That's good, you're listening. Because you were supposed to get to 20% sales of electric vehicles, or zero emission actually. Didn't even say electric, could be hydrogen. And you had to get to 20%, but Tesla as a company is at 100%. So it for 80% of its sales, it got credits from the gasoline industry. And I think that's fantastic. Like, I mean, I don't love Elon Musk. It's the idea that if you were smart enough to get ahead of the game about where society needed to go and actually be an agent of change, which he was, for better or worse, then yes, you want to reward that, because that's enabling people to say, oh, I need to be doing that too. Okay, so that's an example of flexible regulations, and I'll just show you a slide for this. Oh, no, wait, I'm not. Oh, I don't have that anymore. Okay. Oh, later on I get that. Compulsory policy basics, okay? So, you must have carbon pricing and or regulations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So do you notice that I said you don't have to have carbon pricing? So people ask me, and I do help a lot these days, let's say they say, do we need to keep the people running for leadership of the federal Liberal Party, do we need to keep carbon pricing? And the answer is no. And if someone told you had to keep a carbon tax, it's not true. But then you have to have those flexible regulations, which federally we now do have, like in every sector. I can work through that if you want. Internationally, we need these carbon tariffs. So I don't know where the world of tariffs will go. We can talk about that in question period if you want. Don't expect me to give you a lot of answers. I'm as uncertain as everyone else. And domestically though, flex regs, in places like British Columbia, Canada, California, Scandinavia, when you're moving to reduce emissions, those flexible regulations have played a big role, and that's where I've got this slide I was thinking of. This shows emission reductions that were both historic and forecasted in California to the year 2030 by the California Air Resources Board, which is a really good institution, by the way. And what I wanted to show is that the cap and trade system that California belongs to with Quebec, so it's a carbon pricing system by tradable permits, is estimated to account for maybe 15% of the greenhouse gas reductions. The rest of it is happening with those suite of regulations, so on. So that's just an example of thinking about policy. Now, I probably brought you too long into the policy world, And so now I'm in the last phase here, and I've got, I think it's 4 things. Let's see. The simple path, what's slowing us? For 3 decades, experts have been telling us a coordinated global effort won't happen voluntarily. We need tariffs. That actions in electricity and transport are easiest and critical. And that big reductions must be a carbon price and or flex regs. So it could just be flex regs. So that's what we know. So what's causing us to slow walk on that simple path? Well, the first is deliberate efforts to slow walk. And this relates to that first quote I gave you about people's self-interest. So some interests deliberately promote myths to slow action. And you know all of these, so I'm not going to spend time on them. That the climate science is uncertain, this next fossil fuel project's essential, we must await major innovation to decarbonize, and so on. And no point acting until a global treaty, as we're only 1% of global emissions. I mean, people who say that forget that we were only 1% of the effort in World War II to stop Nazi Germany. That's all we were. And, should we have been there or not? Second, there are rigid views that cause us to slow walk. Now, this brings me back to that debate yourself game, because this is where I challenge people to be less perfectionist, to be less like this solution's good, but I don't like that solution. In my view, we certainly now are, not in a position to be picky. And in fact, we never were in a position to be picky. So people like me have been making this argument for a long time. So that we must have nuclear power, we must not have nuclear power. People ask me a question like that all the time. Do you support nuclear power? And I said, I don't know, depends where. If there's some jurisdiction in the world, if Germany now is gonna start building nuclear plants again or refurbish them, or the Swedes just did that, that's what they're doing to get emissions down. I don't know if I would do that, but that's what they're doing. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time opposing that. And what about large hydropower? Same idea. I mean, I think in a place like British Columbia, you're not going to do more large hydropower, and I always oppose Site C. But once that's happening, then okay, it's there, and there will probably be more large hydropower. There's possibilities in Manitoba, in Labrador. That indigenous people are part of developing. I would just be careful about saying that you can be certain that they shouldn't do that. And likewise with biofuels. Oh my goodness, I read into that. You can't use biofuels. We can discuss that if you want. We must not use any fossil fuels, even if they're combined with technologies that capture and store CO2. Well, I challenge you on that. Those who want to slow walk our efforts love this rigidity. So I just ask, let's not let perfection be the enemy of good. So that was number 2. Number 3, I wanted to give an example of this. So Dave nicely mentioned that my books have done well in Canada. This book did well internationally, but it also won the Donner Prize for Best Policy Book in Canada. And I wrote this book over 20 years ago, Sustainable Fossil Fuels. That's not me on the bike, by the way. But for finding that photo, one of my grad students did get a bottle of scotch. But I wrote that book over 20 years ago because I was already thinking about the psychology and biases of human beings. And I was around leading scholars. In this case, it was Thomas Johansson of Sweden and Bob Williams at Princeton University. And they were like, we can use fossil fuels and still bury the CO2. It's really quite easy. And so how are we going to get regions that are well endowed with fossil fuels? Alberta, Saudi Arabia, wherever. How are we going to get them to come along with the climate effort if we're basically telling them we're going to annihilate their economy? They won't agree with the science. They won't do that, many of them. That's just the thing I was talking about human bias. So what I tried to do there was say, how can we work with those regions and say, you can be part of that sustainable future. Maybe you're not going to do nuclear, maybe you're going to do fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage for a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. We'll help fund that, we'll support you. And yet from environmental groups, I got some real pushback on this book. And I said to them, what's your alternative? Like, how were you going to get people in Alberta not to fund alternative points of view or the industry? They didn't, they were like, we'll overpower them, we'll annihilate them. And agenda hitching. So here's another one. And this is an interesting one for an academic to talk about, because to get funding in academia these days, it really helps if you put the word climate into anything you're doing, like, no matter what, to try to get that funds. And so the longer humans have dallied on this, or dilly-dallied, the more everybody started to say, here's the thing we need to do, here's the thing we need to do. And so now when I even doing shows, doing talks and asking people, I'll get very confused people. There's like 100 things we got to do, and I'm going to give you some examples. We have to stop eating meat, stop flying in planes, stop driving cars, stop population growth, stop economic growth, achieve complete domestic and global equity, and abolish capitalism to boot. And all of that in 20 years. So, I mean, I'm being a bit cheeky perhaps, and I don't mean to be, because a lot of these things are are valid pursuits, and I totally respect the people that are pursuing many of these things, not all. And, but the outcome is that when these things get hitched to climate success, then these extra goals make the challenge seem far more complex than it need be, and far more difficult. And that's the point I try to make in the book. So the last one here, and so the people who want to slow walk love agenda hitching. And then the last is the failure to identify, support climate-sincere politicians. And how do we identify those that are not slow walking? Well, you can guess now from the talk, so I'll go quickly. They promise a rising carbon tax and/or increasing stringency in regulations. So I know the BC government has said, well, if the federal government gets rid of a carbon tax, we're also going to get rid of it in BC. But they have said we're going to replace it with the policies we already have. Policies that I've helped develop in BC, as I said, the clean electricity, zero emission vehicle mandate, the methane regs, the low carbon fuel standard. There's actually quite a very effective list. But it depends on the stringency at which they continue with those policies. Yeah, and so those are the kind of things that the government should do. And what political promises are unhelpful diversions? And so this is a provocation. So we can come back to this slide, especially, some people might want to. The promise that industry will pay while consumers pay nothing. And so I've heard that a lot by different politicians at various times, or other people who would really like to blame industry and make them pay. But I've already given you a reason why industry actually can't pay very much, at least the heavy emitting industries. But let's come back to that in a moment. The other is eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. So again, I could talk for a long time about that, so I'm going to provoke you with that one. People say, we've got to get rid of the fossil fuel subsidies. That's going to do it. The estimates we have, and it's in the latest IPCC, I wrote the fossil fuel subsidy section, so my grad students had to read all the articles that have been published in the last 15 years on that. And what you have to understand is that fossil fuels are so fantastic. Sure, they get some subsidies, but even if you got rid of the subsidies, they would still beat out renewables and the other options. So that's not really going to help you. And that's the same thing. Our Earth's crust is chocolate block full of fossil fuels. And so we might say in Canada, let's ban oil and gas export projects and so on. And I've tried to stop projects as well. But I don't put all my eggs in that basket, because that production will happen somewhere else on the planet. So if we do stop our production, we won't have affected the emissions globally one tiny bit. So that's an assertion I'm making. I don't expect you to believe me right now. I'll get through to the question period so that you can come back hard. Okay, and so what's the guide for climate concerns? Okay, I'm on the last 2 slides. I have taken longer, and I apologize. This one's kind of a fun thing. My students help me with this. It's sort of like, some of them are engineers, and they're like, well, you gotta have a flow chart. You gotta have So, does the politician seem sincere? So this is us trying to work our way through this again. No. So we'll get down there in a minute, but yes, they seem sincere. Well, do they have targets? No. Okay. Oh, yes, they do. Okay, good. Well, are the targets linked to policies? Remember I told you we need policies. It's like, no. Oh, but here's some that do. Okay, good. Well, are the policies pricing and regulation, or I should have said pricing and or regulation? right? So there's your, it's pretty simple what you need to look for. And then if yes, you know, are those pricing and regs increasing in stringency? So our zero emission vehicle mandate says that by 2030, this much sales of cars, by 2035, this much. It's rising in stringency. Our zero carbon step code does that. No. Okay. So that's what gets us into citizen activism. And then is it working? Perhaps, so then we go back up there. And if not, we have to be very active. And then if we do get to that yes, then you campaign for and fund that politician. So the last, and you may have to vote strategically under a plurality form of government, which is what we have. So the last couple of slides are kind of add-ons. This is not the order I normally give this talk, so I'm just trying to think of where I am. So a former PhD student of mine is now a professor at UVic, Katerina Rhodes, and she does research on perceptions of policy. So we work a lot in that realm. And she just had an article in the Tyee about, I think a week ago, and it was a fun list, and I thought I would put that list in here. Talk about the future economic benefits, of course, and there are, even though fossil fuels are cheaper, but there are economic benefits to what we develop. And in BC, we're about to develop a bunch of wind and solar. It's going to have economic benefits. Talk less about carbon tax, that was obvious. Improve the flexible regulations that I've talked about, and then without these, rapid electricity growth is not enough without those regulations and so on. But I'll skip that, and I wanted to show this. I gave a talk in Nanaimo in October, or November, just after the election, and this was an election in which and I'm nonpartisan, so I have helped Gordon Campbell and defend his carbon tax in 2008 when the NDP campaigned to axe the tax. And so I'm partisan towards action on greenhouse gas reduction. But the Conservatives in BC in this election, and I can respect people who were voting Conservative for a bunch of other reasons, but on climate, the Conservatives were not good in BC. And they were literally talking about eliminating the flex regs and the carbon pricing. They were pretty honest about that. And so that to me is a time to think strategically, because when it came to climate, the Green platform and the NDP platform were really similar. The Greens had a few things in there about LNG and stuff, and fossil fuel subsidies, which I just told you I don't think count for much. You can disagree with me. And so, what a time to vote strategically. And I had this under plurality, as you know. I'm sorry, we don't live in a system of proportional representation. In my lifetime, there's been 3 referenda in BC to do that. We don't have it. So as a Democrat, my fellow citizens have not voted to change the electoral system. And I have to try to respect that somehow, which means I have to think of the system I'm in. We could have had a government that went one way or the other, and that there were ridings in which the Green NDP vote, the Green vote was huge. So I'm just saying, that's something to keep in mind. I've always been a strategic voter. It means I voted, like if the Green has the best chance of winning in my riding, I'll vote Green, but it all depends. So I won't even go through those, and I'll end it off. Simple strategy: work to elect climate sincere politicians, push them to support flex regs and our carbon pricing, get them internationally Canada was talking about joining the Europeans. Maybe they'll do it with carbon tariffs on the US, who knows? There are people working on that right now. And then personally, it's about space heating, and vehicles is a big part of it. So I will end there. I can see we've got at least 35, 40 minutes for questions and discussion, and I look forward to that. So I'll stop there now. Thank you very much. Oh, yes. Go ahead, yes.
On your slide that you introduced, and I think it was on your last slide as well, so you don't necessarily need to go back to it. I'm just going to look at my notes as I bring
Yep.
the question back up. you mentioned about, removing coal and fossil fuel from electricity production and transportation, especially in the domestic sector, would be a good effective way of going about it. Did I understand that correctly? And
Yes.
You were kind of saying that, the industries will be much harder to bring around. And I'd love to unpack that a little bit, because I'm trying to think about it as like, if I put a solar panel on my home and I change my car to an EV and I like have a heat pump for supplemental heating and cooling, if I make my home net zero, if the industries that are producing the material for the components that I've used to make my home net zero are not changing their part, then the life cycle, or kind of the embodied carbon in my products that I'm purchasing and putting the burden on the domestic users like you and I to kind of curtail those greenhouse gas emissions can only go so far, and it's not really solving the underlying problem of the industry. So how can we also hold, let's do our part for sure, but how can we also hold industry accountable for their major contribution to greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, so in a place like Canada, think of industry as half, and consumers as the other half of our national emissions. So absolutely right. When you tell me, but you're shaking your head,
Yeah.
I live with this data, so 50-50 is a good way to look at it.
Okay.
And assume, so you've said, you've implied maybe a large amount of embedded carbon. So this is the idea that you get rid of your gasoline car, you get an electric car, and then you drive that car for 15 years, but actually the first, I don't know, 4 to 8 years of driving that car, there was all the emissions created in the making of the steel and so on. And actually, it's more like a month of driving the car. So the embodied carbon is really small when you make a choice like to get an electric car. It does depend on how the electricity is made. And so that's why I said electricity as well. Like I said, domestic electricity transportation. Now, does that mean I say we do nothing about industry? No, I've devoted my life to that. I did help design the output-based pricing system we have in Canada, which is now, which is a big deal in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because what it does is it gives a good incremental incentive for industry to make a bunch of investments to reduce their emissions. But its cost, its effect on their cost of production is very small. And so so the oil sands can still expand and export and emit in Canada. And so our biggest source of growth in emissions by far has been the oil sands. So yeah, and so that's why at the same time you were also having policies that subsidize the oil industry to bury the CO2. And then the other way, the only other way, which I said, is we have to get tariffs on people. You will not get a jurisdiction, wherever it is, aluminum in Quebec or steel in Ontario or oil and gas or wherever will ever go along with you to wipe out their industry. They're going to need some way to still compete until they see that their competitors are also facing the carbon charge. And this is why Europe now, which has worked so hard and has raised the cost of industry, has worked so hard over the last few years to develop carbon tariffs, and they're coming out. So that's the good news. And if you want to know what I've been doing in secret, it's lobbying the Canadian government for the last 8 years to get into that, along with some other really good people who played a bigger role than me, actually. Okay, so I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll stop there. And then think about the questions you might want to ask once we get through them.
And there are cookies.
And there are cookies.
So just to follow up on the comments about embedded carbon, is there a good source for finding out what embedded carbon, where the embedded carbon is and how much in different products? Is it a reliable source?
There's a lot of really bad studies out there,
Yeah.
and I wouldn't worry about it. I just wouldn't spend my time thinking about embedded carbon. I would worry about the vehicle that you and anyone else you know is using, and then how you're heating or cooling and cooling your house and your hot water. Man, we do that. It's fantastic. Who was two? Or yeah.
Sorry, I came in a little bit late, but did you touch on heat pumps?
Yep.
And yeah, is it like 2 thumbs up
Yep.
or question marks?
No, absolutely.
2 thumbs up? Okay.
Yes.
And just a question about the electric car versus a hybrid. And what, did you touch on that as well?
No. So the zero emission vehicle mandate in British Columbia, people who are trying to defeat it have said it's impossible. How are we going to get by 2035 every vehicle sold to be an electric vehicle? So first of all, 20% of vehicles can be plug-in hybrid electric. Notice I didn't say hybrid electric. I said plug-in hybrid electric. Because first of all, that'll be like pickup trucks and big vans or used in northern British Columbia. All the people that would oppose these policies because like I need torque and horsepower and blah, 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 blah. like Ram Tough, whatever it is. And so the policy has been totally misrepresented though by certain in the media to say that it's going to force all of us into small electric cars in 2035. So really, but in terms of hybrid cars, a hybrid car is just a more efficient gasoline vehicle. It's wonderful if someone has a hybrid car. You've done wonders to do that. But try to make your next car, if it's still going to be a hybrid, because you still want to have that gasoline option because of where you go skiing or where your cabin is, that's all fine. Because we still see that if you have a plug-in hybrid electric, and this is the research of my colleague John Axon in our department, he's North America's leading researcher in this area, is that we find that if you get a plug-in hybrid electric, you'll still mostly be using electricity with that thing. You don't go up skiing as much as you thought you would, or backcountry, whatever. We think we do, but yeah. So does that help?
So electric.
Yes, well, electric, or I'm always into biofuels. People hate biofuels. We have cars. So in the U.S. Midwest, they're using what's it called? Flex. When it says flex on a vehicle, it can get up to 85% ethanol in it. And when biodiesel is wonderful now, we're making biodiesel like crazy. So that can also be pickup trucks and other trucks. So I've been someone who always argued, because you can tell you the word flexible, I've always said the ZEV mandate should include biodiesel and so on. But instead, we have requirements for diesel that'll phase out conventional diesel. And so it could be that at one point the two policies merge, maybe 5 to 8 years from now, and people realize, why are we doing this anymore? We're able to make renewable diesel without causing a lot of emissions in the process, like the embedded emissions. They're already doing that in California right now. And we're doing it in some in Canada too. So who was next? I gave you numbers.
So, when you were talking about having a club where countries that have reduced their greenhouse gas emissions in Europe and elsewhere have tariffs, you know, and for anyone who hasn't reduced their greenhouse gas emissions, and I was kind of thinking, you know, Canada's record hasn't been great. Would we actually be admitted to such a club?
So the clubs will be related not to what you have done. So that's why I was going to correct you as you were saying that. The club is related to the policies you put in place now.
Okay.
So it's going to be, what's the one of the best is, what's the implicit price of carbon on your policy? So I'll give you an example. With the zero emission vehicle mandate, even though it's not a carbon tax and it's not part of a carbon cap and trade, I can still, or my grad students can still, I'm getting bad at this, but they can calculate the imputed price. And that's how you figure out the climate club. So this is an idea that's been well developed, and the Europeans have been debating this for almost a decade. And now, finally, it takes a long time in Europe to finally come up with agreement on something, and that's where they are. They're stymied right now because of Trump, like the rest of us. And so I don't exactly know where that will go, but there's been a lot into developing that. And I'm just less someone, to me the world is like, I've been working in climate enough. It's like this. So of course I'm concerned about Trump as everyone else, but I'm also trying to calm people down a little bit, because I remember when he promised all sorts of things that didn't happen. He pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement, which was a meaningless agreement. And he said we're going to start burning coal again. He had zero effect on that. He had zero effect on the trend line in cars, emissions from cars. So who was next? Who have I gotten through the whole list, or who was in the original list? You're on the original list. But were you? Okay, then I'm gonna start a new number. So you're next, but just 1, 2, 3, remember your number. 4, 5. Okay, go.
Do you have any advice for local governments that may have policies around how to increase the accountability of said policies and how to integrate the carbon pricing into their operations and outward-looking services as well?
So, you mean like, so the governments should implement, so in the past, but correct me if I'm not got your question right, but in the past, governments, like the Chrétien government, and the Harper government did a lot of stuff where they said, we're gonna do our own emissions in government buildings, we're gonna redo this in our government vehicle fleet, and then we'll get around to policies that affect the rest of Canadians. The only problem is the government emissions are a tiny percent of the total emissions. So, and so I'm less concerned about that, but usually governments are working pretty hard on their own stuff. But is that what you were thinking about, or?
I was thinking about both, yeah. I'm a civil servant, so I'm curious about how do I create more accountability in our own targets and our own policies, both internally and externally as well, when our jurisdictional powers at the local scale aren't quite the same as the
Yep.
province or the feds.
So what I would say is some jurisdictions are moving faster than others, and so find those jurisdictions. It'll be to do with things like vehicle fleets, buildings, but then any of the local policies that you can enact and engage. And I do that in efforts at even my institution where I work, at Simon Fraser University, for example. Okay, who was one? Yep.
Biodiesel. Comment, I maybe you did this in the beginning and I didn't hear it because I wasn't here. Biodiesel takes up land that could be growing food. Biodiesel also emits carbon, but the fertilizer and the tractors and the whatevers. Can you comment on how that picture all fits together?
Yeah.
Please.
So none of that needs to be true.
Okay.
So
Because-
the way in which you develop your fertilizer, the way in which you run the tractors that are on the farm, run them on biodiesel. We do see that it's a land that's coming. So if you think the amount of land on the surface of the earth is at a fixed amount, of course the amount of land on earth is fixed, but if you think the amount that's arable for food and energy and even fiber production, that can expand and contract, and the productivity can expand and contract, and we see that all the time. So it was really, I'll just give you an example. This isn't the biodiesel, or maybe it is. The Norway was getting, I guess it was biodiesel from Malaysia, and then people said that's horrible. It's palm oil. You were knocking down indigenous forests to grow the palm oil plantations, and the Malaysia, and so they cut off imports of biodiesel from Malaysia. The Malaysian government said that's nonsense. Come and work with us. So the Norwegians did that, and they're developing plantations that also have some mixed diversity in them. Humans have a footprint on the planet. I'm not saying we're going back to the Garden of Eden, but they finally got it where the Norwegians and now all Europeans have a criteria for how the biodiesel is produced. I run into people who are anti-biodiesel, and they always describe it in the exact same way. And I'm like, oh my goodness, no, it's made so many different ways. Develop a criteria, decide what's good. Right now, we're starting to be flooded with biodiesel from California, which is really coming from agricultural waste. So it really will depend. And so all I'm asking, and that was the last slides, which you saw, which was to say, be careful about being strongly pro or against anything. But there may be cases where you're like, no, this is not the right thing to do here. But I really would emphasize that what I did talk about earlier on in the talk was how to, if you think from what I've heard, biodiesel is a disaster for the following reasons, and you kind of listed them. The challenge I would give to you is to debate yourself, is to start researching around the world arguments for where, in some cases, done in certain ways, biodiesel might not be so bad as you thought. And that broadens our list of options.
And those would be, in your mind, how, if you were devising a policy for the production of biodiesel, the criteria, what would they be?
They would be the list that you just gave. And in fact, that's what you can look this up tonight, the European criteria for biodiesel imports. Yeah, you Googled it.
I'll give myself number 6 after your.
Okay, who, that was one, who's two?
Early on, you teased us with your emphasis on the open burning of fuels, and that to me implies its opposite, which is closed burning. Can you put us out of our misery and sort of speak to that? Is that somehow part of the solution here? Is there such a thing as closed burning? Can it be done at scale? What's that all about?
Right. So the book I wrote, Sustainable Fossil Fuels, you have to buy it. No. So I explained it at great length there, but I'll boil it into the following. What we know is that fossil fuels are really rich chemical energy. So you can combust them, but then you're going to have to, and if you don't want the CO2 byproduct, CO and CO2, to go into the atmosphere, you're going to have to capture them. And that's what we did with acid emissions when we burned coal, and that's what we did with nitrous oxide emissions, and that's what we did with particulate emissions. With nitrous oxide, we changed the burn, but with we captured particulate emissions. We figured out a technology to still use coal when we said it was impossible, but then we still let the poor coal industry kept doing what it was like. Okay, you don't want acid rain, we'll do this. You don't want particulates and smog, we'll do that. And of course, they didn't do it easily. We had to threaten them with all sorts of stuff. But and now it's like you got to capture the CO2. So there are plants around the world now that capture the CO2 as it goes up the smokestack. It gets bathed in an alkaline solution. That you recycle the alkaline.
Alkaline.
What?
Alkaline.
Yeah, alkaline. Anyway, I'm not good on the chemistry stuff. And so that's called post-combustion carbon capture and storage. And what I pointed out in that book is that people said it's impossible to store CO2. It's an unknown technology. And then I worked with David Keith, who has worked with Bill Gates to do carbon engineering in Squamish. And this is 20 years ago. David Keith, just a good colleague of mine at U of Calgary and Harvard. And so we did some papers on this as well and some research. And it was amazing how much we've buried CO2 over the decades. So let's say natural gas in northeastern BC, if it has a lot of sulfur in it, we call it acid gas. And so you have to put it through a processing plant. And actually, sometimes it doesn't have that much hydrogen sulfide. It can be 70, 80, 90% CO2. It's also acid, I guess. And so I don't know that. But anyway, so we have injected into sedimentary layers, 1,000 meters down. We've done that for decades, easily. And we can measure, and we have, did it move? Where is it? CO2 pipelines to transport CO2. They've had that forever because, they've had that for 40 years, or 50 years. It was 40 years when I wrote the book, so it's 60 years, where you get CO2, and we actually take CO2 reservoirs from under the earth to go and inject it in an oil well somewhere to keep the pressure and it's called enhanced oil recovery. So we had all the technologies, it was easy to put them together, and that's post-combustion. Pre-combustion is you'd actually convert, you go through, it's called the Fischer-Tropsch process. It was developed in Germany in the 1916s. And it's how the Germans were able to make fuel out of coal in the Second World War, maybe even the First. But that process can be used to convert any hydrocarbon into hydrogen, and you're gonna then separate the CO2. So that's pre-combustion, because then you're gonna burn either transport the hydrogen, use it in a car somewhere or in an apartment or to generate electricity, or right there you're gonna use it at the plant to make electricity. So those are the two ways. we have not developed them. They're all mature technologies. People say, well, yeah, but we don't have them everywhere. So, of course we don't have them anywhere. It's because we haven't been able to sustain the policies that phase out the open burning of fossil fuels. But in the last little while in Canada, the federal government really helped, and industry so we have some major projects going on right now of CO2 recovery. Not enough, but we do have them. So that was a long answer, but a great question. Who was after that? Who was like three? Okay, go ahead.
Another biodiesel question.
Okay, that's the last biodiesel question.
Back in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of interest in doing the biodiesel, and people used to collect the French fry oil and filter it and filter it and filter it. But this is really small scale, right? We weren't importing from Malaysia, but I was told you could only use it in an old type diesel. These new high-tech diesels that you have now are pushing out so much more pressure, and they need a lot more lubricant, so that wouldn't work.
Yeah, well, you would have to, so first of all, as a supply source, it's too small, right? So it is kind of a niche thing.
Yes, yeah.
And you do have to process it more. And I think that's the point. Like you can process it enough to run it without destroying a biodiesel engine, but I do have kind of a funny anecdote story about that. One of my sons, he's now a professor of economics at UBC, but like he did his PhD elsewhere, but he did his undergrad degree at UBC in engineering, and he headed the group of engineers for sustainability. And then they got a lab at UBC, and they were getting all the cooking oils from all of the restaurants at UBC, and they were making biodiesel. And then they were able to get the university to agree to have a couple of its diesel trucks to use this stuff. And then, like, he told me, like, as he was fleeing the university, that they destroyed the engines on these two trucks. And I said, no, you never heard this from me, okay? But yeah, so it's.
This is being recorded, you know, just.
Yeah. Well, he'll be fine.
We can edit.
Yeah. They'll take it out of his paycheck. Wait a minute, are you in the right order?
I don't know.
I'm number 4.
You're number 4.
Yes.
And then I'm number 5.
And then you're number 5, she's 6, you're 7. Okay.
What about this?
Yeah,
Perfect.
I had the open burning thing, but I thought of another one. In terms of electrifying, do you have like a sense of capacity, particularly in BC where we have hydro electricity and all that, as we continue to electrify, how are we doing capacity-wise for generating and what might the future holds with climate change if we don't fill our reservoirs?
Right. So this is a great question, and I'm very much on this question, but as the head of the BC Utilities Commission, I have to be careful as well, because I have the status of a judge, and so I'm not supposed to be biased when it comes to evidence that might come before me. But there has been a bit of a campaign on to say that we're in big trouble in terms of our electricity system. Now so I could go on forever on this, so I better be just nice and concise here. A hydro-based system, which we have in some other jurisdictions, Manitoba, Quebec, Norway, New Zealand, Switzerland, a hydro-based system is called energy critical rather than capacity critical. And what that means is that we're not really worried so far about the peak demand on January 25th at 4 p.m. when it's freezing cold throughout British Columbia. And the reason is because we size every dam and its generators to get the best output in the peak flow of water, which is like, I don't know, May or June. And so if you added up the peak capability of all the dams, in the past, it's been way above what our peak electricity demand is. But what we've been worried about is not having enough water in the dams, so that in a whole year, we don't have enough energy from that. And so that's energy critical as opposed to peak capacity critical. Now, in thermal systems where they've got natural gas burners, or maybe now it's geothermal or biomass burners, they build to meet the peak. And because they're never worried about energy, because they've built a capacity, and that capacity, some of it's only used like 5% of the year just to hit the peak. So it could run all year long. And so you've actually got enough energy, but you're worried about the capacity. So actually, I've gone faster than I thought I would. This is good. I'm ready to terminate. So in drought years, which we're in, or drought periods, and then of course we don't know what a drought period is because of climate change, maybe it's the new normal. But in those periods, then we're connected to neighbors so we can buy from them. And what we've been doing over the last year, BC Hydro has been buying solar electricity from California because that's when the price is lowest and that's when hydro can buy it. And so it's been, Blake Schaefer, who's an economist at the University of Calgary, who is a young economist, but he's so sharp in this stuff, so I rely on him a lot. He's very good. And he calculated that it was like 3.5 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour, which is very, you know, after everything's added on, like delivering, you pay 10, 11 cents, your second step, 14 cents. So we got that pretty cheap. Because for the Californians, they have so much solar on their roofs, they're generating all this electricity at 2 in the afternoon, and they actually need it. In fact, often, in the drought, we bought a lot from them and kept some of it, but we also, in the past, and a little bit now, bought from them at 2 in the afternoon and sold back to them at 5 or 6 in the afternoon. But we bought it at 2 cents and sold it at 18 cents. Because of and so our only constraint was how big was the intertide going down the West Coast. So my answer is, as we start to use electricity in peaking kinds of uses, like generating, recharging your car, if you do it just when you get home, you know, in that time that could be peak, or your heat pump, trying to heat up the house because it's the start of the evening. That's going to be a challenge. But the solution, and the Norwegians have already done this, is to give people charges, and we're doing this in BC now, that will reward some people for shifting their demand, charging their car later at night, shifting some other things about their hot water system, maybe even their heating system, maybe having a battery in their house, which the Californians are doing like crazy now. And so that's the job of BC Hydro and your Utilities Commission to be putting in these kinds of tariffs. And and there's some work going on with that right now, because we are going to need to be, thinking about that. But it doesn't always mean that we have to put in more capacity. It could be that we're able to get people to shift demand, and more that can be done in automated ways as well. Right? So that's the exciting world, and it's happening in parts of Europe and in California, and I have our staff just laser focused on those jurisdictions. What can we learn? What can we learn? What applies here? Nice question. Yep.
So can I just ask one tiny bit to follow up, and then I've got another one. So,
okay.
But
we'll judge. We'll see.
Well,
okay. Yeah.
So the question is, I know a lot of people here are thinking about solar panels on their house, and I know some people that are doing it, and they're actually giving back to the grid. Does that help with that peak demand?
Yeah. So it may or may not. And we'll have tariffs that'll tell you.
Okay.
And so, for example, though, I mean, the good news is, if we are in a really cold snap in BC, it does tend to be sunny. I mean, we're in that right now. Yeah. So your solar will create more. So I think the answer will be yes. It may not help you with 7 in the evening, obviously, and that's why. But we're lucky because BC Hydro has, it can turn on. We call it ramp up or ramp down how fast it gets that electricity in, which is really important because wind and solar sound cheap, but they're not. They're expensive because you have to have storage with them of some kind or another, because we call them non-dispatchables. It's like having a non-dispatchable ambulance service. You're lucky, they're working now, so they'll come, but don't call them. And that's what wind and solar are like. So it isn't cents per kilowatt hour. Wind and solar are great, but you need to match them with some storage. And that's why BC is probably we're in the best position, us in Quebec, in North America, and one of the best positions in the world to do a lot of wind and solar right now, which we are.
Okay,
Oh.
my follow-up is to the, way earlier talking about, consumer EVs. So, how do I phrase this? So, there are communities that where people own their own homes and they've got, Sunshine Coast put a lot of EV charger stations in. We have an EV charger station where owning the EV is easy. Then there's jurisdictions, like I was living in North Vancouver for a while and I was in an apartment and, I was going to buy a car and I really wanted to buy an EV, but I went, how am I gonna charge this? So what kind of policy is being considered, you know of, to help encourage infrastructure for these consumer EVs?
Yeah, so if I could show you a graph, that's growing at a tremendous rate. And it's growing from standard utilities like BC Hydro. We say to BC Hydro, just go, like just put them in everywhere, and they are. But also private companies like Petrocan. And then the charging companies, Flow, ChargePoint, and so on. And so I've had an electric car for 5.5 years, a Chevy Bolt. Some of my ex-students are consultants, they also get Teslas, but anyway, I got and my partner, she has a Leaf, and hers is 7.5 years old. And it is like night and day to charge our vehicle compared to a few years ago. It is so much easier. Now, it's still a big challenge if you live in an apartment, a condo, and that's where policy is working on right now. And yes, the Scandinavians are ahead. Like I go to Sweden and I'm shocked. So we're trying to catch up, but we are moving fast right now. And in fact, everybody seems to be pulling along with that one. Even the auto industry now is starting to move in that direction and realize, we need to make sure people can charge their cars. But I mentioned John Axon, the colleague of mine, and he's always surprising me with stuff. And he was telling me that, yes, condo owners might need charging stations, but it's something like 95% of EV owners, their charging is all done at home. Just go home and they plug it in. And they're just thrilled that they don't have to go to a gas station somewhere. You have to line up, but
But if you don't own a home that is conducive to that, that's the issue,
yeah,
right?
and so that's why, in new buildings now, they're saying, okay, you've gotta have at least 4 stalls for that. And all I can tell you is, yes, if you get an electric car right now, depending on where you live and so on, you will find some challenges. They're way less than we had 5 years ago, and and so you'll just be pleasantly surprised over the coming years of how easy it gets. I was just last weekend over, I have a little place on Gabriel Island, and they had a really slow charger there, so I always just plugged in at my cabin, and it's like the real slow one. I have a faster charger at home. And then I just went past the co-op, and they had put 2 new fast chargers in. And my car was almost full, but I just had to try it. And instead of having to join Flow and everything, I just stuck my credit card on there, bingo, it was so fast. You used to have to join this different app and then put $25 down, and then did you ever get it back? It's really a lot easier now. It's getting
And I think that's essential because,
Yeah.
people can't make those choices unless they're gonna be able to do that charging and also that distance thing, right?
Yep. A friend of mine, Dave, I forget his last name now, he was the deputy head of the Green Party of Canada 15, 20 years ago, and he was on the National Roundtable of Environment and Economy with me, but then he bought a Chevy Bolt, it's gotta be 8 years now, and he drove it across Canada. And then he wrote a book about it, right? Because it was like the creative things he had. It was so fun listening to his stories about how he survived. Yeah, sorry. Who is next?
Number 7?
All right,
6 we're on next.
6, and then you're next. Okay.
Can we go back to the slide at the slide that was the 3rd reason why we are slowing down GHG reductions, and I think it was kind of saying to let's not slow down by trying to solve all the problems, right? Oh wow, sorry, this is really becoming a very great topic.
No, I'm listening to you. I'm listening. Go ahead.
Animated slides, one more, I think.
Yeah, I had them all on these little bullets.
Thank you. It's
This
good to
one?
have it in, yeah, that's the one. Abolish capitalism. That's the one.
Yeah.
And to your comment on the biofuel purchase and kind of thinking about putting criteria and policies that support the good way of going about doing business, for example. That's just one example, but on all things, maybe my statement is more a comment than a question, but I think that on all levels, not just for addressing climate change, probably we do need to keep in mind, how do we create better global equity, how do we abolish capitalism, how do we address the underlying causes that are exacerbating climate change? And I'm curious to hear if you might agree with my comment or if you might challenge it, because when I hear the overall kind of presentation that you give on the policies and the kind of the impact of policies and assessments of that and the power that they hold, I think that we can still try to solve it all while addressing climate change.
I wouldn't make any of these a condition of addressing climate change. If you have a goal like that you don't want population growth anymore, then go ahead and work on that. But we don't need to solve population growth to get to zero greenhouse gases.
Well, what if capitalism and global lack of equity is underlying reason of climate change?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's the amazingness of fossil fuels. And so when I look at countries that, well, even, I don't know if you think, maybe you think every country is capitalist in the world now, but let's just say environmental concerns by different types of government. So in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, we had non-capitalist governments in Eastern Europe, in Soviet Union, in China, and they didn't do very well on environment. So to tell me that capitalism is the thing that's anti-environment, I actually think it's more to do with the benefits we might get from something. But that's what I believe, and I could argue that a lot. That doesn't mean I'm right, and that I don't know, the opposing argument is wrong. But that's the way I would see it. And in the book, there is a chapter in there in which it's a long story. I'll do the short version. Every now and then I used to write for the Canadian Literary Journal. I used to do book reviews for them. I never liked doing it, but Bronwyn Draney was the editor, and one time she said to me, Naomi Klein's coming out with a book called This Changes Everything. I want you to review it. I said, I'm not reviewing it. I'm working on my own book, I'm too busy. And then about 3 weeks later in the mail, the book shows up on my door. This is what Bronwyn's full of tricks. And she knew it would work. I read the beginning of the book, and here was Naomi Klein saying, this is the end of capitalism. Now, she didn't really tell us what her replacement for capitalism was, but it suddenly was...
Green New Deal, social democracy, anyway.
Social democracy? You mean like Sweden? Yeah, that's a very capitalist country. And
it depends how you define
I'll tell you, I'll define capitalism. I got no problem with that.
We don't need to get into all that.
Yeah, okay, but anyway, it's to do with the ownership of the means of production. Someone,
The Green New Deal has some excellent points.
So I'm not attacking the Green New Deal. No, she didn't call it the Green New Deal. Read her chapter.
Yeah, I've read it.
Okay, so she says this changes everything. So what is everything? So I worked through it, and it seemed to be autarkic, so there was no trade, there's no energy trade. All the energy development happens locally. So I can tell you right now, that's a very inequitable world, because the cost, it's energy trade that has made, indigenous communities in British Columbia and any isolated community got diesel. Most amazing thing for those communities and their well-being.
Which they're doing everything they can to get off of. So.
Yeah, they are now, but yeah, because they think they can get something cleaner. That had an amazing benefit for them. My friend Kirk Smith, he was on the intergovernmental panel with me and on the global energy assessment, professor at Berkeley, passed away a few years ago. And I just remember, and then I got into the literature, but him saying to me, Mark, you do understand, fossil fuels going into small villages in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s saved so many lives of women and children who are otherwise burning solid materials near a fire in an enclosed area that's not ventilated properly. And he has the numbers on the estimates of the deaths that's entailed. So it's really crazy about fossil fuels. They actually gave a lot of benefit. And I knew I'd be provoking you, and I hope, rather than just dismiss me, you go and look for some of those things. And I reference them all in the book.
I'm number 7.
I'll be number 8.
I wanted to say something else about that though, so just hang on. Oh, so we're gonna get rid of capitalism. And so that's gonna
Transform
happen,
it.
that's gonna happen over the next 20 years. So that's how fast we need to get our emissions down. So I grew up at age 4 delivering literature for social democratic parties because my father was very left-wing. And in those elections, the NDP, which would be your social democratic approximate federally, was somewhere in the 15 to 17% of what Canadians voted for. Now I'm old, it's still at that percent. So when you tell me we're gonna change capitalism to address climate change, I'm like, you know what, keep working on the capitalism thing, but can we please do the simple things that we know we can do and that we're already having success, sometimes in capitalist jurisdictions, for electricity generation, for vehicles and so on. So that's the message of the book.
Yeah, and there we can agree.
Good.
There's no issue in that.
Now, oh, you are,
Number
okay,
7.
go ahead.
So you say in a reductive sense, stop eating meat. But actually the movement has been to reduce industrial animal agricultural products, which is meat production, eggs and dairy, which have an enormous footprint. And that's proven, that's a fact. Let me finish. I've made a long form couple of films about it that have been distributed globally. So I'm like, I've steeped myself in the
I was
research
just
as
gonna ask
well
you to
about
define
that.
footprint, because I didn't know what you meant.
Yeah, so I mean, conventional or industrial animal agriculture is about 14.5% of emissions, and that does not include transportation. So it's roughly around the same, on par, with transportation sector. And it is absolutely recognized globally as number 2 in terms of emissions. So it is absolutely on a personal consumer level, something to, however you want to approach it. You know, for myself, I'm mostly vegan for ethical reasons, but that would be the stop eating meat thing that's very like extreme for most people to even wrap their head around. But I think that it's very pragmatic and responsible to include reducing industrial animal agriculture as part of your regular daily consumption.
Thanks.
To have a good climate footprint.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I agree with your intent for humans to eat less meat. I eat very little meat, and for reasons like that, but not for the footprint, because the data doesn't support that. So, I know you made movies about it, but please contact me, because I've been doing this CBC climate panel with Melissa Lem, people might know her, and she had told me about this footprint, and I contradicted her on the radio. I said, I'm looking at the data right now, and I also know secondary data, and it's a much smaller percentage than what you're talking about. It's in the 3 to 4 to 5%. And so then she threw me a bunch of stuff that was not very good science. It was advocacy. And so I dug up all the stuff for her. So I'm happy to pass that to you.
I've seen it. But I think there's also a lot of.
But how did you decide which one you were gonna believe?
Are we gonna get into an argument about?
No, but
the
I'm-
animal
the whole point of my
agricultural
talk.
sector? The animal agricultural
Okay.
sector has a huge footprint.
No.
It does.
Yeah, okay. Not from the data, but from
It-
in your mind.
And its impact on water, soil, all of those things are bad. So.
I would agree with you. They're bad,
Yeah.
but that's why I asked you
So
to find
as an
footprints.
environmental-
For solving climate,
Yeah.
they're not gonna do it.
Did your data look at deforestation from the agricultural industry?
Sorry, the what?
Exactly.
Did
Thank
your
you.
data look at the deforestation that's caused by the agricultural industry and factoring carbon sequestration?
Thank you.
Cause that's where the big impact.
It's
So you mean that the
Huge.
deforestation that's going on where, for
Everywhere.
agriculture?
Yeah, everywhere.
So any of the deforestation,
For agriculture.
right, so,
Especially in the
so
Amazon.
I was looking at Canada, so I wasn't looking at
Yeah,
deforestation.
look into that, cause that is.
So but I've looked at the global numbers, have you, like on the IPCC, like what's the number then, I wanna know.
I don't remember right now.
I'm
but that's
sure it'll be
where the
way
big-
lower than what she's referring to, but we can look,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
The meat lobby is so powerful. They're as
Okay,
powerful
you
as
know what,
the
I'd
oil and
let
gas
you
lobby.
ask. Okay.
And they have their own
So who's the
scientists
next question?
that feed the
Just so everybody,
public.
just so everybody gets a chance, I think it's,
Sorry.
I think we should, somebody else has another question?
What film should we go watch?
Yeah. None. Oh, I mean, sorry, but yes. So my point is I will engage, and I love that. And it doesn't mean that I'm saying you're completely wrong, but I was asking
I'm
you about the source. Good. And I was asking you about the source of the data. So that's something to look into. Okay, so I'll pass on. Yep.
Wow. My question is about LNG. And what I found, Mark, is that when I talked about it and talked to different people about it, is that there's often even so simple a disconnect is that some people don't realize LNG is actually natural gas, as simple as that sounds. And what I see in the media is that LNG is the cleanest LNG in the world from BC, and that's the end of the topic. Not about all the chain of where LNG is produced, i.e. natural gas is produced, through that process of the issues around that and all the different stages until it's regasified and burned in Asia. Do you have that? I mean, that's what happens in the media. It seems too simple to me in terms of that complex
Right. So
environmental issues.
Yeah. So my answer will be, is if you have major issues with the production processes that come to produce the natural gas, that then we may ship to the coast and make into LNG using a lot of energy in order to export it. You need to sort of tell me where it is along the line. But if you argue that the LNG causes higher greenhouse gas emissions where it's exported, the evidence doesn't support that. Because, and this is the point I was making earlier, the Earth's crust is chock-a-block full of fossil fuels. So I hate the argument like if we don't make it, someone else will. But it is true. It's not an argument for us to make it. And I testified before a U.S. congressional committee to try to stop Keystone XL pipeline. And I was a chief witness for the city of Vancouver in an attempt to stop the Trans Mountain pipeline. But those pipelines, my simple point is if I were being strategic, I wouldn't focus all my effort on stopping pipelines. Because I would much rather, I think it's more strategic and effective to focus on getting our emissions down. And I mean, I don't want to rely on Norway, but that's the strategy that Norway is following. They're exporting more natural gas to Europe right now, as in a pipe, which is at least not as energy intensive as making LNG. But and while at the same time they're going so fast to zero emissions within their economy, and it's having an effect on vehicle markets, on what people do in buildings, and so on. And we could do that too, and we're trying. So have I worked through the numbers? And so I can start numbers again, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
And I'll be 7.
7. Okay.
Very small.
And so I should write down which number I'm at, and you have to be honest. Okay, number 1.
Number 1 is the big picture. We've just blown through the global average temperature increase to over the 1.5 degree Celsius. Most scientists that I read about say we're not stopping at 2. Was reading this morning, a couple of days ago in the Globe and Mail, talking about the methane release in the tundra, and that they think this positive reinforcement is going to increase the tundra methane. So where is the positive hope for the future with all this happening?
Right. So we are likely going to head into scarier territory. And to me, the biggest reason is because humans are really bad at global governance. And so it's really hard in any one jurisdiction to be able to keep rallying everyone to keep doing this, unless you're able to go past some tipping points, as Scandinavians are doing now, and California is getting close. And if you keep an open mind to even biofuels, and things like that. But what I say to my kids or my students is, and there's a chapter in here on this, it's a chapter about World War II. And it's a chapter about, there was all these signals for countries to act together, and they didn't. And we're so ineffective at that. And then, it's amazing how quickly, when we finally got to a point of emergency, what we did. The stuff we did, you might not think is great. Like, we figured out how to make a nuclear bomb in a couple of years. Oh, great, But, we humans are now engineering the planet. We're engineering it in a harmful and risky way. And so we're gonna have to engineer it in another way. And so an example will be, so I actually think that when we realize we have to get serious on this, none of this will be smooth like people like me would like. Increasing our effort, being smart about it. It will be like this, and it'll be catastrophe driven and related. And tipping points where a bunch of countries are strong enough to form a climate club and put pressure on the rest, and they finally come along. And where we're suddenly using technologies like crazy to vacuum CO2 out of the atmosphere. And that's why when David Keith and Bill Gates and others start putting money into stuff like this 15, 20 years ago, they've actually developed a bunch of technologies that are recovery technologies. They're not the preventative ones, which is what I've strived for my whole career. Yeah.
So when you read about, you with the IPCC, and see data on the tundra, and you hear about the methane off the coast, embedded off the coast, do you think there's a reasonable chance of some kind of a runaway methane release? It's
just not my area of expertise. I read the stuff in Nature Climate all the time. The feedbacks mostly seem, again, I'm not an expert, the feedbacks mostly seem to be positive feedbacks, which is a bad thing, right, as opposed to negative feedbacks, which would counter it. I mean, I just heard though just read that the carbon uptake in the boreal forest is increasing significantly. Don't say I said that, I think I read that. And then I thought, well, that makes sense. So I don't know. But generally, the message I get from scientists, I'm here as a policy, human economics, technology, action, and I think we need, this priority is not going away. And at some point, right now the United States kind of flag this as it's a bipartisan thing. If you're ideologically this way and ideologically that way, it's not nearly like that in Europe. It's not nearly like that in Japan. It's not nearly like that in China or like all over the world. So we have to be careful that we don't just see the world through the lens of the US. That's what I try to warn people from. Okay, who was
number two?
You two, okay. One's a comment, and two questions. Comment 5% of greenhouse gases coming out of animal productions is not nothing.
5%?
Or I think you said
14
4.
and a half.
Never mind, wait a minute. You said 14, you said 4. I'm just saying 4 is not nothing. That's my comment. We don't have to go further with that.
And I'm not sure it's 4. I want to look at the numbers. I've produced the numbers for Melissa Lem, and I got them from good sources.
I don't need to go down that rabbit hole.
When you tell me I said 4, I wanted to qualify it. I said, I think it's 4. I know it's 4. I need to do that, because people miss
I
coal.
can give you lots of
My-
stats.
My two questions are, the first one is about geothermal. I don't think we've heard anything about that here, and think about the potential for that. The second one is a question about the life cycle of LNG. Everything I've heard is that burning it, it's not so bad comparatively to a lot of other things. But the life cycle, when you look at production, transportation, compression, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is that it's worse than just plain burning coal. Would you comment on that?
Right, so wait a minute, the last one was LNG, was natural gas versus coal, and then natural gas with LNG added on if you want. There are even researchers who have said natural gas alone, without ever getting to LNG, has the upstream and pipe
Exactly.
leaks.
I mean, you put the whole thing.
And coal plants leak methane.
Yeah, I'm just saying that.
So I don't know. What I can tell you is I follow that literature. I was with a whole team reading the literature for the last IPCC, and there are better researchers and not so better. And what I would advise you to do is not be selective. Be careful. Try to go for the researchers who are at the top schools, because there's been very rigorous processes how they got there or in top positions. But just before that, you mentioned something else.
Geothermal.
Oh, geothermal. And so geothermal is interesting because we used to associate geothermal with just really hot spots close to the Earth's surface, a few hundred meters down, or even closer, so it's anywhere in an active tectonic area, Japan, Iceland, California, Italy, Philippines. And now there's a new kind of geothermal that's developing, and it's a geothermal, and I was talking about this with a couple of people here earlier, it's a geothermal based on using the technologies we developed from fracking, so all the horizontal drilling, and doing that now instead of in shale rock, doing it in granite, and but I'm always careful when I hear things like this, because everybody will hype what they think is their next answer. So I put it in limbo. And I was trying to, a motive of my talk is to try to get you to be willing to put more things in limbo, to be less certain about what you know. And so there's hope that geothermal, if it works that way, could be better than wind and solar because it is dispatchable. Yeah. Great, thank you.
Potential in BC?
Anywhere. So then you don't need hotspots. Who was 3?
I don't know if there's somebody before or.
We did 2. Are you 3?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
So going back to your original quote around people don't want to put themselves out of a job, how do you have any thoughts on the human cultural elements that we can build into these complex cap and trade systems that involve a lot of people having a job and making money off of these trading systems? How do we create a culture there that they're going to be happy with phasing themselves out in a few years or hopefully a couple decades?
Right.
That point eventually will become smaller.
So I'm going to broaden out your point, and you tell me if I missed. But I spent a lot of time with people thinking about transition, like how do we make it happen? And that's why I was going a little bit after change capitalism, just because where we see we've made progress, it's usually in a decade or a decade and a half. So if you can try to do something that causes the significant change in a decade or a decade and a half, you've maybe gone through 2 political cycles. And then within the 3rd or the 4th, that government's probably gone, but you may have transitioned where there's a whole bunch of people now whose livelihoods are associated with the new system. And so they are now becoming lobbyists on your behalf. So give an example of Europe, because I think you mentioned cap and trade. Europe started its cap and trade in 2005. And then there was 2008, we had the huge economic recession. Should they abandon it? And already by then, there was people who made money as financial traders in permit trading in Europe, and they became huge lobbyists. I remember some of them wanted to fly me to Europe to go speak to politicians. I didn't go, but they were doing everything they can to keep that system to survive, and in Europe it survived. I'll give you another example is when, in Ontario, a government got elected in 2003 and said coal generated 25% of the electricity in Ontario in 2003. And they said in 4 years, we'll have zero coal. Now, people like me, I try not to do a lot of media because it's a ridiculous claim, but they were trying to go fast. And I knew they couldn't, we all knew they couldn't do it in 4 years, but we were like, okay, go. And they went really hard. They won the next election. And so this was the McGuinty government.
Liberals.
Yeah. And so it ended up that by the time they got to the end of their second mandate, basically the coal plants were already in shutdown mode. You know, they had stopped to do the maintenance. They'd already figured out what they built some natural gas, but a lot of it was they were making progress in refurbishing at nuclear and some hydro facilities and doing some other small stuff. Run-of-river hydro, wind, and solar. So all of that combined, and they were effectively, they went past the point of no return, and we got rid of it. And so, and that's been happening with coal throughout the United States. So I hope that's an answer. It's just the idea that I'm agreeing when we think about what is the dynamic of successful change. So more and more people are studying that, and I spend more time reading and listening to sociologists, so not just political scientists, but that's why I showed you the thing from Katja Rhodes. She's in the School of Public Administration at UVic, but really she's working a lot, again, with Scandinavian scholars on what worked in Scandinavia and what didn't in terms of this flipping, and where is it, and what about California and all the other jurisdictions. That was 3, who's 4? Okay.
Mark, first of all, my dad used to shock me by saying I needed to read The Economist when I was young, and I never believed him. Would you trust The Economist in general? First of all.
It's a leading question.
Your timing is bad. The Economist, well, The Economist would be an example. They would say you gotta do a carbon tax. Because the Economist kind of has an ideological position, right? Which is neoclassical economics, and it's kind of in its purest state. So we only want policies that are very pure, that affect prices. And so The Economist will tend that way. The Economist is really good sometimes in just a general analysis of a situation, political mostly, sometimes economic. But it was funny, one of my PhD students said that for my next lab meeting next week, we should get everyone to read this article by The Economist, which was saying people had underestimated the real cost that it'll be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So on the ferry coming over, it was on the bus to the ferry, and I was reading it, and it was a terribly written article. Like the person, so sometimes with The Economist, they're a little bit too quick and flippant, and they haven't really paid attention to what the top research is showing. So I'd be careful with The Economist. Yeah.
So my understanding from their analysis of our environmental economic future right now is that they're worried that if the government in the South brings in their tax cuts, this is going to cause a major recession. That's perhaps the biggest risk that we're facing is that how much do you see the possibility of a major recession that will not allow us to then invest in the clean future?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. One, I should have said this earlier, when you said The Economist, I usually push back on my students or anyone else because it's not The Economist, right? There will be writers for The Economist. Sometimes you might get an editorial position. Sometimes when the Globe and Mail does an editorial, Pat Brettauer will phone me, but it's usually about climate policy, and he's pretty good. But, so I don't know if there's a position of The Economist. So I want to know who's the writer. And that's why when I was reading this article, I was like, who's this writer? Do I know this person? What do they do? Your general point, though, regardless of the source, a source that I would pick, though, is always the Haas School at Berkeley. Haas at Berkeley. Fantastic scholars, very rigorous, really good. But are we headed into a major, I cannot predict that. So I shouldn't say anything. so many things. What I would say to people is, you hear about what Trump's doing, and then the media has to tell you a story of all the things that'll happen after he does that, and then a few days later, he didn't do that. And if you look at his first term, it was amazing the things he was going to do and never ended up getting done. And some of it was because it ended up looking like it would be unpopular he wants to be popular. Even if it's his last term, he wants to be popular among the people, the Republicans. And so this is what Canada's trying to play at. So I think Canadian leaders are trying to say, let's target, this is what we did before. They were gonna come in with tariffs, and then we ended up renegotiating the Mexican-Canadian agreement, and we didn't have a major recession because of Trump. So I just cannot, if someone predicts for me this is what Trump's gonna cause, I'm skeptical. I'll put it in limbo. But I'm skeptical of someone who can confidently say that to me. The media might, because that's their job, is to get you to read their article. But,
well, their analysis was that we were just lucky not to have a recession in his first term. And
yeah,
they were
I hear you.
basically saying that everything is so much more down to the wire. There's no wiggle room anymore. And
yeah, so
if he brings in a $1 trillion tax cut, that then could put us over into a recession.
A tax cut causing a recession? Yeah, I don't see that, but I don't know. I mean, there's so much behind something like that. I'd have to see details. Okay. So I wouldn't be able to make a statement like that. Definitely not. And if someone said that, I would think, wow, what did you put together for that? Or did you want to say something that was really strong? Yeah. So I don't know. So that was 4. Who's 5?
You talked about myths earlier on, and just in speaking with friends, one of the myths that seems to be out there is that there's no way we can have enough solar power or wind power in BC to get us away from fossil fuels, or I guess to get us away significantly from fossil fuels. And what this seems to do with the people that I'm talking to is that it gives them a sense of, well, what's the point of trying? Almost like it's hopeless anyway. And like, I don't know, I mean, I've got solar panels on my home because this is something I really wanted to do. But I don't know what to say, because I don't know what the percentage is. How much solar panel can BC get into using, or
right,
or wind power, etc. Like.
Yeah. So sometimes this works for some and not for others. But I would suggest you might want to do a little study of Norway. Like, just read about its buildings. They're not burning fossil fuels. All of their buildings. Read a bit about their electricity system. It's not burning fossil fuels. I think there's one little gas plant out in the platform. Read where are they with the vehicles, right? They're now at near 100% sales, which means about 30% of the stock of cars are electric. So, what's going on with their demand? Are they able to do this? It's not easy. So as a regulator, I'm really paying attention. But if someone tells you we can't do it, they have to explain to you why another jurisdiction did.
So I don't know, but is Norway geographically, are they using a lot of wind power? Are they able to use, no? Okay.
They're putting in a lot of wind, but they're a lot of hydropower like us.
Okay.
So it's hydro and solar, is that primarily what they're doing?
Not a lot of solar. It's hydro, it's waste heat. In Oslo, they also have a municipal municipal burner. It's also a different kind of geothermal. It's just chilling and heating. You can heat rocks and water deep underground and then recover it later on. So it's using, and then they are putting in wind, and I'm sure they're putting in solar as well, but I don't know the data. I don't know the data on that, but I can tell you, it would be. Oh, I do have the data on my laptop actually, but it would be. So assume the electricity is basically zero, and assume that 70 to 80% of it is hydro. So it's very much like BC. same population, same location on the coast, same mountainous area, roughly the same GDP per capita, so same standard of living, same amount of people concentrated in one area and then dispersed in the north. So it's some of the north houses are bioenergy, and even a couple of the communities are burning some wood as a bioenergy system. And it's 5 million people. So it's a fantastic example, actually. And it's also a fossil fuel producer.
I think it's 8:30, so if anybody feels like leaving, please feel free to do so. And those who feel like staying for a little longer, we were thinking of adjourning to Gibson's Tap Works. I don't know if folks are interested in that, but maybe we could sort of finish up the questions here.
Did I get through I got through those?
Joe, I think Johan's got his hand up.
All right, so, oh yeah.
And I'm fine to withdraw my question.
Okay, great. I'll take the last two, okay?
Yeah, no, that's fine, yeah.
But then I should stop anyway and let's go to Tapworks or something. My voice is
That'll
really-
solve all the problems.
Yeah, exactly.
Or it will appear to.
So it's Johan, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. My question is, climate scientist, Canadian climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe communicates a lot about this, and specifically about getting people talking about the issue. And I look around the room at who's here, and I think about how many people live regionally who may have heard about the workshop and were able to come but chose not to come. And I'm curious what your take, and I know it's not necessarily your area of expertise, but you have been working in the area your whole life around how do we increase community and societal engagement on this vital topic. You look at what's happening in our own country in Banff this past summer. What just happened is unfolding in Los Angeles. Climate systems are being upended as we're in the midst of all this change, and it is impacting. Climate anxiety is on the rise. Kids are experiencing it on increasing levels down to very young age. And so I'm going to throw in a bit of a hook here. Have you thought about connecting with someone like Taylor Swift to see if you can get the message out a little bit?
You're Taylor, fabulous.
Definitely. Well, she wasn't able to convince people to vote for the Democrats.
It's true.
So, but no, I don't mean to be flippant. So I actually don't think it'll be like a mass movement that gets this done. And I think you're almost we're being a bit unfair to humans if we think they're all gonna become like these activists. Humans have a lot of different interests, and some of them are quite selfish, and some of them are legitimately self-focused or something else. And a major problem like this that's global in nature is going to have that feeling for people. So what I used to do was when I did a lot of radio back, CBC and Bill Good's show for like a decade and a half, and so a lot of callers, and I used to have fun with that. Callers, even then, it was like, this is a big concern, it's scaring our children. This is 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And they'd say, we gotta get everyone acting on this. And I'd say, okay, tell me now, do you agree that we basically addressed acid rain? Say, yep. And I say, so can you tell me, what was the movement that caused that? How many people, what percentages, what did we do, what did you do to stop it? I said, what were the policies? People don't know. What you need is, it's a small percentage of people who are very active and are clever in how they engage on the political side. But those people, whether they're activists or it ends up being politicians, do need more of us to be more strategic. And that's why I wrote the book. That's my plea, to help people be a bit more effective. And I use the same example with smog pollution, with ozone depleting substances. Humans have been able to act and achieve a deal with environmental threats, certain effluents and so on. Of course, if it's a more localized threat like effluents, it's easier to act because it's right there. Smog is easier, it's your airshed. And so yes, this is a tough one, but I wouldn't say it. I just think if we tell ourselves we have to have this mass movement, then we won't succeed. In the Trudeau government, every policy that I think we needed has been implemented. And in the the California government has every policy, and these are being copied even in the developing world, not with as much teeth or stringency, but that is happening. And we are lowering the costs of the cleaner options. And I want us to do that with carbon capture and storage as well, and we are starting to do that too. So I would not I hope you don't walk away from this sort of in despair or pessimistic. And all I'm trying to do is say there's a dynamic out there. There's a young generation of engineers, finance people, legal people, so all the things we need who are totally focused on this question. And then there's big progress being made. It's way too slow, and that's the problem. But it is happening. So do what you can to be part of that tipping. And so I commend Dave and the group for organizing things like this, and this is why I say yes to things like this. I am quite busy. I'm doing 2 jobs right now because I still run a lab of 9 graduates and 2 research associates at the university while I'm full-time at the Utilities Commission, trying to accelerate electrification. I took on the job when Dave Eby asked me because I thought there's where I could do a little bit, right there. And that's what I worked on.
We do have more than 1% of the population of Gibsons in this room.
But I have my child on a tablet and there's no childcare available. So I think that's a part of your answer of why people are not here. 6:30 to 8:30, it's on a weeknight,
Sure.
night, it's a challenging
My
time.
partner's able to be with mine too, so that's why I'm here.
And I love tablets, because they let
Oh, you're
her-
welcome.
let
See you,
me
Jerry.
share.
More tablets.
Yeah, maybe hand tablets at the entrance.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. My dear Uncle Walter used to say there's no polish without a little friction. So thanks for adding a little bit of friction, as
Oh,
well
yeah.
as lots of lubricant. So.
Yes, absolutely, and please don't take offense. I will debate, but there's no anger there or anything like that, and I don't assume that in anyone else either, so.
Yeah. That was super. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much.